February 11, 1976, Joe Barboza stepped out of Duffy's Tavern in San Francisco, heading toward his Chevrolet while carrying a loaded revolver beneath his jacket. Before he reached the driver's door, a van rushed beside the curb, then 4 shotgun blasts smashed through his chest before he could even pull the weapon. Detectives first identified him as Joe Bentley, though federal agents already knew the bleeding man once terrorized Boston nightclubs by biting flesh from another man's face during a drunken confrontation. Years earlier, he helped the FBI cripple the New England Mafia through courtroom testimony that also buried innocent men inside prison cells for decades. By the time Joe Barboza hit that pavement, half of Boston wanted him dead, and the other half wanted the truth buried with him. But in his prime, the story looked very different. The making of the animal. When San Francisco patrol officers searched Joe Barboza's pockets that night, they found identification cards carrying the Bentley name, though the fingerprints immediately triggered federal alerts tied to witness protection files. That discovery confused local investigators, mainly after federal agents quietly arrived while refusing to explain why a protected government witness had just been blasted outside a neighborhood tavern. Reporters digging into the homicide quickly learned that Barboza was connected to Raymond Patriarca, the most powerful mafia boss in New England, though another layer emerged after lawyers linked him to FBI agent H. Paul Rico. The story became even dirtier once names like Jimmy the Bear, Flemmy, Stephen Flemmy, Joe Salvati, Peter Limone, plus future Boston underworld figures like Whitey Bulger started circling the same files, making it clear this killing reached far beyond one street shooter catching revenge. What looked like a mob assassination slowly exposed a crooked relationship where gangsters, informants, prosecutors, federal handlers, plus desperate street crews all used one another whenever survival demanded ugly choices. Long before Boston newspapers called him the animal, Joseph Barboza Jr. was another angry Portuguese kid growing up around the docks of New Bedford, Massachusetts, where hard labor shaped nearly every family living near the waterfront. He was born on September 20th, 1932, inside a struggling immigrant household led by Joseph Barboza Sr., a former boxer whose temper carried through the apartment almost daily. Around those neighborhoods, most Portuguese families worked in textile mills, fishing boats, warehouses, or cramped sewing shops, though many streets already looked beaten down after the whaling economy collapsed decades earlier. Empty buildings sat beside crowded bars, while hustlers, bookmakers, drunks, dock workers, plus small-time thieves moved through the same corners every evening without much separation. Joe grew up watching men settle arguments through fists instead of conversations, which partly explains why violence became normal to him before adulthood even started. After his father abandoned the family when Joe was 12 years old, the bitterness inside their household deepened quickly, leaving his mother, Palmetta, struggling to raise 4 children inside a city already drowning in poverty. Teachers remember Joe as explosive, restless, stubborn, plus constantly fighting other students over insults that most boys ignored without much thought afterward. Police records later showed that by 13, he was already facing arrests connected to breaking into businesses throughout New Bedford during late-night burglaries with neighborhood friends. Those early crimes brought him into juvenile detention centers, where older inmates introduced him to gambling schemes, stolen goods, safe cracking, plus the rough prison code controlling Massachusetts lockups during the late 1940s. Instead of frightening him away from crime, confinement slowly transformed into the place where he learned the status came from intimidation, retaliation, plus making people fear crossing your path. By 1950, Barboza landed inside Massachusetts Correctional Institution, Concord after another conviction, though even prison officials noticed the young inmate seemed addicted to confrontation whenever authority figures challenged him publicly. Guards later described him as muscular, unpredictable, deeply paranoid, plus obsessed with proving nobody could embarrass him without immediate consequences following afterward. That obsession exploded during the summer of 1953 after Barboza joined 6 inmates during one of Concord Prison's wildest escape attempts in decades. Reports later showed the prisoners consumed stolen whiskey, swallowed amphetamine tablets, overpowered several guards, then escaped through the prison grounds before scattering across Boston neighborhoods during a reckless 24-hour spree. During those hours outside custody, the group wandered through Scully Square bars, fought random civilians, stole cars, plus bounced between Lynn, Revere, and East Boston, while police chased rumors across the entire region. After officers finally recaptured the fugitives near an East Boston subway station, Barboza returned to prison carrying an even bigger reputation among hardened inmates who respected reckless behavior. That reputation kept growing after he punched guards without warning, hurled furniture during cell confrontations, plus attacked correctional officers for minor disciplinary disputes. Inside those prison walls, Joe developed the mindset that dominance mattered more than consequences, which later followed him directly into organized crime circles throughout Boston. The disturbing stories involving his teeth also started spreading around Massachusetts during those same years, though details changed depending on who told the story afterward. One version claimed Barboza ripped flesh from another inmate's ear during a prison fight after the victim insulted his family near the cafeteria. Another rumor described him chewing part of somebody's cheek during a nightclub altercation before calmly spitting the bloody flesh onto the floor beside horrified witnesses. The most famous incident involved Henry Tamilio, a respected mafia figure who reportedly warned Barboza against slapping another man during a heated confrontation inside a Boston club. According to several underworld accounts, Joe answered by biting the victim instead, then grinning while reminding Tamilio he technically never touched the man with his hands. Whether every detail happened exactly that way never fully mattered afterward, since the rumors alone transformed Barboza into something larger than another violent hoodlum roaming New England streets. Around East Boston bars, gamblers, bookmakers, plus nightclub owners started calling him the Animal, partly through fear, partly through fascination, though everybody understood the nickname carried real danger behind it. For a short period, boxing looked capable of dragging him toward a cleaner future after he started fighting under the nickname the Baron across Massachusetts venues. Joe trained seriously enough to win several fights, while future Massachusetts State Auditor Joe DiNucci even sparred with him during local gym sessions. Inside boxing clubs, trainers noticed that Barboza possessed real punching power alongside surprising speed for somebody carrying such a thick frame. Unfortunately, discipline outside the ring never lasted long, which became obvious after repeated arrests interrupted whatever momentum he had built professionally. Some nights, he worked docks or bounced inside bars trying to survive. Honestly, though, he always drifted back toward gambling collections, robberies, plus violent debt enforcement. Friends later explained that legitimate work bore him quickly, and prison already convinced him that fear produced faster money than patience ever could. Even while chasing boxing opportunities, Joe stayed connected to East Boston street crews operating around Bennington Street, where local criminals regularly gathered inside bars, later nicknamed Barboza's Corner. Those same hangouts eventually pulled him toward the orbit of Raymond Patriarca, whose organization controlled large sections of organized crime throughout New England during the late 1950s plus early 1960s. Patriarca operated differently from loud television gangsters appearing inside Hollywood movies, since he preferred quiet meetings, political influence, gambling profits, plus carefully organized violence whenever somebody crossed the family. Joe desperately wanted acceptance from those Italian mob circles, though his Portuguese heritage permanently blocked him from becoming a fully initiated mafia member despite everything he did for them. Some associates mocked his complexion behind closed doors, while others openly called him racial slurs directly to his face, even after he carried out dangerous assignments benefiting their rackets. That humiliation slowly poisoned him internally, especially after realizing mob leaders happily used his brutality while refusing to treat him like an equal partner afterward. The resentment became stronger once Jimmy the Bear Flemmy entered his life, since Jimmy carried full mafia connections while sharing Joe's appetite for ruthless violence during Boston's bloody underworld wars. Jimmy Flemmi operated with colder instincts than Barboza, which created a dangerous balance whenever both men worked together during collections, robberies, plus gangland executions. While Joe exploded emotionally during confrontations, Jimmy stayed calm enough to calculate escape routes, witness problems, plus retaliation before violence even started unfolding. Stephen Flemmi also floated around those circles, though federal investigators later discovered Stephen secretly worked with FBI agent H. Paul Rico much earlier than most people realized publicly. Together, the Flemmi brothers plus Barboza became feared throughout East Boston after several bodies connected to gang conflicts started appearing across alleys, vacant lots, plus roadside dumping areas. Harold Hannon was murdered during the escalating underworld conflict, while Wilfred Delaney died after entering the wrong vehicle during another retaliatory shooting connected to rival factions. Ray DiStasio plus John O'Neill also crossed paths with Barboza after plotting against him, though both men eventually ended up dead following an ambush inside a Charlestown building. Around those killings, the old rumors returned stronger than before, with stories claiming Joe chewed fragments of skull after one execution, while another witness swore he bit a victim during a violent beating. By the early 1960s, Boston already felt like several different gang wars happening simultaneously across tightly packed immigrant neighborhoods tied to bookmakers, labor rackets, plus street-level hustlers chasing influence. Buddy McLean led the rising Winter Hill faction from Somerville, while the McLaughlin brothers controlled dangerous Irish crews operating throughout Charlestown during an increasingly savage feud. Patriarcha tried balancing both sides carefully, though bodies kept dropping faster once shooters began retaliating almost weekly across taverns, parking lots, plus crowded intersections. Barboza moved directly through that chaos beside Jimmy Flemmi, taking assignments wherever violence benefited the organization financially or strategically during those unstable years. Every neighborhood seemed connected to another crew, carrying shotguns, revolvers, stolen cars, plus grudges stretching back several years through Boston's criminal underworld. Before long, Joe Barboza stopped looking like another reckless street criminal from New Bedford, mainly after fear itself became part of his reputation across the entire city. The war, the hits, and the man who wanted more. By 1964, Boston's underworld had stopped operating like quiet rackets controlled through backroom meetings, mainly after the feud between Buddy McLean's Winter Hill crew and the McLaughlin brothers turned entire neighborhoods into hunting grounds. Bernie McLaughlin's murder years earlier already poisoned relations across Charlestown and Somerville, though the bloodshed intensified once George Punchy McLaughlin started targeting anybody connected to Buddy McLean's side. Joe Barboza slid directly into that conflict beside Jimmy the Bear Flemmi, carrying out hits whenever Patriarcha-aligned figures needed problems removed without hesitation afterward. Cornelius Hughes became one of those targets after his growing reputation inside McLaughlin circles made him dangerous enough to threaten Winter Hill operations throughout Boston gambling territories. Not long later, Stevie Hughes also landed inside the crosshairs after surviving repeated attempts connected to the same war, though his luck finally collapsed during an ambush near Route 114 involving gunmen tied to the Flemmi Barboza side. Witnesses later described bullets shredding through the vehicle before it crashed into a swamp embankment, leaving Stevie Hughes and Samuel Lindenbaum dead, while Lindenbaum's small dogs somehow survived beneath the seats. Through all those killings, Barboza moved across the city less like a traditional mob soldier and more like hired weather rolling through whichever neighborhood suddenly needed bodies dropping overnight. That reputation spread beyond gangsters surprisingly fast, mostly after civilians started hearing stories from bartenders, gamblers, truck drivers, plus terrified debtors trying to avoid crossing paths with him after dark. Joe handled collections throughout East Boston using methods that even older mob guys considered excessive, mainly after several victims turned up carrying puncture wounds from ice picks driven through cheeks, shoulders, or kneecaps during brutal debt punishments. One gambler reportedly missed loan payments tied to a sportsbook operation before Barboza smashed his hands using a carpenter's hammer inside a basement near Chelsea. Another small-time hustler allegedly ended up hospitalized after Joe stabbed him repeatedly through the arms while calmly demanding overdue money in front of witnesses drinking beer nearby. Those attacks built a strange atmosphere around his name, where civilians feared him more intensely than they feared actual mafia bosses like Raymond Patriarca or Gennaro Angiulo. Patriarca rarely needed public violence since his authority already controlled Rhode Island, Providence, Federal Hill, plus large sections of New England rackets through quiet influence. Joe worked differently though, since he seemed addicted to making examples out of people publicly, which slowly transformed him from a useful enforcer into a dangerous liability. Raymond Patriarca understood that problem early, though he still relied heavily on Barboza whenever difficult assignments required ruthless execution without emotional hesitation afterward. Patriarca operated from the National Cigarette Service headquarters on Atwells Avenue inside Providence's Federal Hill neighborhood, where politicians, bookmakers, corrupt businessmen, plus mob captains quietly visited throughout the week. Unlike Joe, Patriarca rarely raised his voice publicly, mainly after decades of organized crime taught him power worked best when delivered softly through other men's actions. Joe desperately wanted acceptance from that inner circle, though the family never allowed him fully inside despite everything he did for their operations. Italian associates mocked his Portuguese background constantly, while others openly referred to him using racial insults even after he murdered rivals, benefiting their organization directly. That rejection started eating at him harder once he noticed Jimmy Flemmi gaining more trust, despite participating in many of the same killings beside him. Around those years, Joe began carrying weapons almost everywhere, modifying vehicles with smokescreen devices, alarms, plus extra protection after repeated rumors suggested rival shooters wanted him dead already. The paranoia mixed badly with his ego, causing him to push harder against mafia authority figures who preferred disciplined earners instead of unpredictable street animals, is creating unnecessary attention. That tension exploded after Joe walked into a nightclub connected to Gennaro Angiulo's protection network and demanded additional payments from the owner, despite Angiulo already controlling the operation financially. Angiulo was not some loud street fighter chasing instant revenge through emotional reactions, since he built influence patiently while managing Boston's North End gambling empire with careful calculation. He viewed Joe's behavior less like disrespectful freelancing and more like direct interference against the family's structure, which quietly placed Barboza into dangerous territory afterward. Instead of backing away, Joe kept escalating problems while carrying himself like somebody untouchable through his relationship with Patriarca plus Jimmy Flemmi. Around East Boston, people noticed he looked increasingly exhausted, suspicious, plus aggressive whenever unfamiliar cars parked near his home or followed him through side streets. Some local cops believed multiple attempts had already been made against him before 1966, though witnesses rarely cooperated once shootings involved mafia-connected names. The pressure kept building, while another major problem developed around Edward "Teddy" Deegan, a low-level criminal whose burglary activities eventually dragged Joe toward the most important murder of his entire life. Deegan had reportedly stolen money connected to Patriarca-linked operations, which made him a liability inside underworld circles already consumed by gang war paranoia during the mid-60s. FBI informants later revealed that Jimmy Flemmi and Joe Barboza approached Patriarca seeking permission to eliminate Deegan before things spiraled into broader retaliation problems. Federal agents secretly recorded parts of those conversations through bugs planted around Patriarca's operations, meaning authorities already knew murder plans existed days before anybody fired a shot. Instead of intervening, the FBI quietly monitored events while building larger organized crime investigations tied to Patriarca's hierarchy across New England. That decision became the first major crack, exposing how badly federal handlers were starting to compromise themselves while chasing bigger criminal targets through dangerous informants. On March 12, 1965, Deegan was lured into a Chelsea alley near an office building after being told a burglary score was waiting nearby. Jimmy Flemmi, Ronnie Cassesso, Roy French, plus Barboza were all connected to different parts of the setup, while multiple firearms later turned the alley into a brutal execution scene filled with shell casings. Witnesses later described Deegan collapsing near garbage containers after being struck repeatedly with bullets fired from several different weapons during the ambush. The killing itself lasted seconds, though the aftermath quietly poisoned Boston's justice system for decades after federal agents started manipulating what information prosecutors actually received. Informants immediately told the FBI that Barboza and Jimmy Flemmi committed the murder, while additional reports confirmed Patriarca approved the hit beforehand through organized crime channels. None of that stopped authorities from slowly shaping another version of events behind closed doors, while continuing relationships with violent informants useful for future prosecutions. Meanwhile, the city itself moved on quickly after Deegan's body disappeared into another pile of gangland headlines, filling newspapers throughout the mid-60s. Joe returned to normal business almost immediately, handling collections, gambling disputes, plus violent enforcement work, while believing his position remained secure inside the patriarchal organization. He had no idea the same murder would eventually destroy nearly every relationship surrounding him once federal agents realized he could become far more valuable alive than in prison. That realization hit Joe brutally during October 1966 after Boston police arrested him inside the combat zone while he rode around carrying a serious weapons arsenal alongside associates. Authorities slapped him with a $100,000 bail amount, which practically guaranteed jail time unless powerful people stepped forward financially. Barboza expected Patriarcha's organization to rescue him quickly after years spent killing, collecting, plus protecting their rackets throughout Boston. Instead, days passed without help arriving, while rumors slowly reached him claiming mafia figures may have tipped authorities toward the arrest intentionally. Sitting inside jail, Joe finally understood that men like Patriarca and Giulio, plus other captains, viewed him as useful muscle rather than a respected family member. The betrayal cut deeper after Arthur Tash Bratsos and Thomas DePrisco scrambled desperately across Boston, trying to raise money for his release despite the increasing danger surrounding anybody still loyal to him. Those efforts ended horribly once both men carried roughly $59,000 toward the Nightlight Cafe during a supposed bail arrangement before disappearing completely afterward. Their bodies later surfaced, stuffed inside a vehicle dumped in South Boston after mob-connected killers murdered them during the setup, stole the money, and then attempted to shift blame toward Irish gang rivals operating nearby. Not long afterward, another Barboza associate named Joey Chico Amico also ended up dead, while Joe remained trapped behind bars, realizing his entire support system was being erased piece by piece. Jimmy Flemmi still maintained contact, though even that relationship now carried uncertainty once federal pressure, mafia paranoia, plus gang war politics started colliding together behind closed doors. Inside jail, FBI agents H. Paul Rico and Dennis Condon eventually approached Joe carrying recordings where Raymond Patriarca reportedly called him expendable while dismissing his value completely. That moment changed everything surrounding Boston organized crime, mainly after Barboza finally accepted the ugly truth that years of murder bought him absolutely no loyalty once survival became inconvenient. Joe Barboza spent years killing for the mob, then suddenly realized the mob had already decided he was next. The ultimate mob rat. When H. Paul Rico and Dennis Condon walked into Barboza's jail world, they were not just visiting another locked-up shooter looking for mercy. They came carrying the kind of leverage that could flip a whole city, including recordings where Raymond Patriarca dismissed Joe as a bum who could be thrown away. That hit Barboza harder than another street threat, since the same boss he killed for now sounded ready to leave him buried inside the system. Rico understood the moment perfectly, while Condon helped shape the offer into immunity, protection, relocation, plus a new identity if Joe turned government witness. Barboza caught the play instantly, realizing the FBI needed a superstar rat who could walk jurors through Boston's murder machine from the inside. Once Joe took the stand, the courtroom saw a different version of the man East Boston feared for years. He was no longer the guy with ice picks, shotguns, face-biting stories, and bodies tied to gang wars across Chelsea, Revere, Somerville, and Providence. He sat there calm, detailed, and almost businesslike, which made his testimony feel stronger to jurors who expected monsters to sound wild. That calm voice became deadly in the Deegan case, where Edward Teddy Deegan's 1965 murder got turned into a courtroom trap for men Barboza wanted buried. Peter Limoni, Henry Tamaleo, Louis Greco, Joseph Salvati, Roy French, and Ronald Casesso all got dragged into the story, though the FBI already had files pointing toward Barboza and Jimmy Flemmi as the real killers. The cruelest part landed on Joseph Salvati, a working family man with minor street ties who had once owed Barboza a small debt. Barboza told jurors that Salvati helped drive during the Deegan hit, then added that absurd detail about Salvati wearing a wig to resemble Jimmy Flemmi during the murder setup. Somehow, that madness still worked, and Salvati lost decades, while his wife Marie raised children under the weight of a conviction built on a lie. Limoni watched his family grow from behind prison walls. Tamelio died locked up, Greco died still insisting he was innocent, and Casesso plus French carried their own destroyed years through the same poisoned case. The streets had always known Barboza was dangerous, but now his mouth was doing damage no gun could match. Behind that testimony, Rico's FBI already had hidden reports, informant statements, and recordings that contradicted Barboza's version of Deegan's murder. Those files named Jimmy Flemmi showed Patriarca's approval and exposed the government's real problem, which was that their useful witnesses were also killers they wanted protected. Instead of handing over the truth, agents buried it, letting Barboza lie while Rico shielded relationships that later connected to Stephen Flemmi, Whitey Bulger, and John Connolly. Even lawyers around Joe became targets, especially John Fitzgerald, whose car exploded on January 30th, 1968, after dynamite was planted under the hood. Fitzgerald survived, but the blast took part of his leg, proving that even standing near Barboza could cost a man his body. After court, the government moved Joe into protection under the name Joseph Bentley, sending him to Santa Rosa, California, where he enrolled in culinary school like some regular guy trying to reset. That setup sounded crazy from jump, since they gave a professional kitchen to a man linked to more than 24 killings. It got worse in 1970 when Clay Wilson crossed him after a barbecue dispute, then ended up shot, stabbed, burned, and dumped in a field. Local police had a murder case, yet Rico, Condon, and U.S. Attorney Edward Harrington appeared on the defense side to protect their informant from the harshest consequences. By then, Barboza was not just a mob rat anymore. He was the prototype for a corrupted system that later helped men like Stephen Flemmi and Whitey Bulger turn FBI protection into street power. The fall, the exonerations, and the real legacy. After leaving prison during the mid-1970s, Joe Barboza tried building another criminal lane around San Francisco while still hiding beneath the Joseph Donati and Joseph Bentley identities. He bounced through bars, gambling spots, street hustles, plus small rackets while carrying himself like somebody still chasing authority instead of survival. That became the real problem with Joe, since prison, witness protection, federal money, plus new names never changed the part of him addicted to violence and control. People close to him later said he honestly believed California had weak organized crime leadership compared to Boston, which made him think he could slowly build influence again. Meanwhile, back in New England, Genaro Angulo never forgot the humiliation tied to Barboza's testimony, his freelancing, or the federal cases that damaged the Patriarca family years earlier. The revenge came together quietly after James Chalmers, a small-time South Boston figure connected to Joe socially, leaked Barboza's San Francisco location to Angulo's people. From there, Ilario Zanino and Joseph Russo reportedly handled surveillance around the Sunset District while waiting for the cleanest moment to strike without attracting unnecessary police attention. That patience mattered, mainly after the Mafia had already spent nearly a decade hunting the same man who once helped federal agents tear apart their structure. On February 11, 1976, the waiting finally ended outside Duffy's Tavern after Joe stepped toward his Chevrolet carrying a loaded Colt revolver beneath his jacket. Before he could react, shotgun blasts ripped through him near the curb while witnesses watched the former underworld terror collapse onto a San Francisco street. F. Lee Bailey later reacted coldly after hearing the news, explaining that society had not suffered a major loss, which showed how even people who defended Joe understood his ending was probably unavoidable. What nobody outside federal circles fully understood yet was how much damage still sat buried beneath the Barboza cases for decades afterward. During the late 1990s plus early 2000s, hidden FBI documents finally surfaced, showing agents already knew Barboza and Jimmy Flemmi committed the Teddy Deegan murder, while innocent men carried prison sentences tied to fabricated testimony. Congressional hearings later exposed suppressed recordings, concealed reports, plus deliberate protection surrounding informants like Barboza, Stephen Flemmi, and eventually Whitey Bulger. The report, titled "Everything Secret Degenerates," described the scandal as one of the greatest failures in federal law enforcement history after courts overturned convictions tied to Peter Limon, Joseph Salvati, Henry Tamelio, and Louis Greco. By then, Greco had already died behind bars. Tamelio died in prison. Salvati lost nearly 30 years of freedom, while entire families carried damage impossible to repay through court settlements. In the end, Joe Barboza became several different things at once, depending on who remembered him afterward. Some saw a violent street enforcer shaped by Boston gang wars, while others remembered a racial outsider desperate for mafia acceptance that never truly came. Federal agents viewed him as a weapon useful against organized crime until that same weapon started exposing their own corruption publicly. The mob betrayed Joe once he became inconvenient. Joe betrayed the mob after realizing loyalty meant nothing, while the FBI betrayed innocent men trying to protect dangerous informants from prosecution. Even the informants eventually betrayed one another through hidden deals, buried evidence, plus quiet cooperation agreements stretching from Barboza into the later Whitey Bulger era. Joe Barboza did not just leave bodies behind in Boston. He left behind a blueprint for corruption that kept spreading long after he was gone.